quiet Tuesday morning. Coffee. Then red and blue lights flooded my driveway. Neighbors peeked through blinds. Phones already recording. I stood still, coffee mug still in hand. Something felt off about how fast they arrived. Karen's smile flickered the moment she saw the officers. Her hands trembled slightly, gripping her clipboard too tight. What she didn't know was already in motion. My name is David Reeves. I'm 38, a contractor, married to Renee, a nurse, and father to Mia, 7. 2 years ago, we bought our first house in Willow Creek Estates, a tidy suburb outside Charlotte, chasing the quiet life every young family dreams about. We painted the shutters ourselves, planted a maple tree for Mia's birthday, and joined the neighborhood group chat with genuine excitement. Renee baked cookies for the welcome committee. I mowed on schedule. Please be home. We had no idea one woman ran it like a kingdom. Karen Whitfield had been HOA president for 11 years. Everyone called her the mayor, half joking, half not. She wore blazers to walk her poodle and carried a laminated copy of the HOA bylaws in her purse, ready to quote a clause the way other people quote scripture. At the welcome barbecue, she inspected our lawn before she shook my hand. Grass is a touch long, she said, smiling. I laughed, thinking she was joking. Renee squeezed my arm. Later I'd learn nobody in Willow Creek laughed at Karen's jokes, because Karen never actually made any. The first notice came 2 weeks in. A pink slip taped to our door. Mailbox paint faded, in violation of Section 4.2. I repainted it that weekend. A new notice appeared days later, this time about our trash bins being visible 11 minutes past pickup. I mentioned it to our neighbor, Gary Tran, the HOA treasurer, over the fence. He winced. With a stopwatch, he said quietly, then glanced over his shoulder like the hedges themselves might report him. I laughed it off. Linda Osei lived 2 doors down and served as Karen's self-appointed enforcer. She photographed our porch daily, texting screenshots into the community chat with captions like, concerning pattern, whenever our welcome mat sat crooked or a package waited an hour on the steps. Renee started closing the blinds earlier. Mia asked why the lady with the clipboard always stared at our house. I told her it was nothing, just neighborhood stuff. But I noticed my jaw tightening every time Karen's SUV slowed in front of our driveway. At the next HOA meeting, I asked, politely, why our family seemed to receive more violations than anyone else on the block. Karen smiled without blinking. I hold every home to the same standard, David. Some people simply need more guidance adjusting to community living. The room went quiet. An older board member shifted in his seat but said nothing. I later learned Tom had tried pushing back on Karen years earlier and lost his seat on the landscaping committee for an entire summer as punishment. Fines started arriving by mail. $50 for a basketball hoop, aesthetically incompatible with the street. $75 for a garden gnome Mia had picked out herself. I paid them, not wanting trouble, telling Renee it would blow over once Karen realized we weren't a threat. It didn't blow over. Karen realized I wouldn't fight back loudly. Quiet people, I'd learn, made the easiest targets in her world, because quiet looked like weakness, and weakness looked like an invitation to push harder, again and again. One Saturday, I built a small wooden bench for our front porch, Something simple for Renee to sit and drink her tea. By Monday, a violation notice cited unauthorized structure altering the community's uniform aesthetic. I stared at the paper, genuinely stunned. I called the HOA office. Apologetic, admitted off the record that Karen personally reviewed every home on our street twice a week. She's very thorough, the woman whispered, then quickly added, please don't mention I said that. Renee suggested we simply comply and move on. Avoid the fights. Save our energy for Mia and work. I agreed, mostly because arguing with Karen felt like arguing with a wall that somehow also filed paperwork against you. I removed the bench that weekend. 2 weeks later, a new notice appeared. Our tree, the maple we'd planted for Mia, had grown excessively, casting shade onto the Whitfield property line. Karen demanded we trim 18 inches off the crown or face a $200 weekly fine. I measured the tree myself. It hadn't touched her property. I photographed the distance and sent it to the HOA board. Calmly, professionally. Karen replied within the hour. Photos can be misleading. I trust my own eyes more than a contractor's camera. That line stuck with me. As if my profession made my evidence less credible than her opinion. I started keeping a folder on my laptop. Dated screenshots. Notices. Emails. Renee called it paranoid. I called it insurance. B. At a block party, I overheard Karen telling another neighbor that some families just don't understand community values. She didn't say my name, but everyone glanced my way. Renee's face went red. I squeezed her hand under the table and said nothing. Again, Mia asked why nobody talked to us as much as before. I told her some grown-ups get confused about what neighbors are supposed to do. She nodded seriously, the way kids do when they sense something adults won't explain, and went back to her juice box. Karen began attending city council meetings, referencing our street as an example of declining community standards whenever debates about zoning came up. A councilman later told Gary that Karen requested extra parking enforcement specifically for our block, citing chronic non-compliance issues. I started documenting everything meticulously. Timestamps, photos, certified mail receipts. My cousin Tony, a licensed private investigator back in Ohio, joked over the phone that I was building a case file worthy of his job. I laughed. True that would become. By month 5, we'd paid over $600 in fines for things other houses on the street did openly, unpunished. I began noticing patterns. Karen's targets always shared something. Newer families, younger couples, people who hadn't lived there long enough to know the unwritten rules. The real spark came on a Sunday afternoon. I was standing on my own porch, coffee in hand, watching Mia ride her bike down the driveway, when Karen's SUV rolled up slower than usual, window lowering with theatrical precision. "You're loitering," she said flatly. I blinked. My own porch. Karen. She lifted her phone, already dialing. This is exactly the kind of behavior that makes residents uncomfortable. I've warned you before about intimidating presence in shared visual space. I laughed, genuinely thinking she was joking. She wasn't smiling. A patrol car turned onto our street. Renee stepped outside, confused, Mia frozen mid-pedal. My heart pounded. Not from fear of the police, but disbelief that this was actually happening. The officer approached cautiously, hand near his belt, clearly briefed on something serious. "Sir, we got a call about a man loitering aggressively near private property. Possibly armed." Armed. I hadn't touched anything but a coffee mug since I woke up that morning. Renee's voice cracked as she stepped between us. "He lives here." The officer glanced at Karen's SUV, then back at me, visibly recalibrating. Neighbors gathered on their lawns, phones raised, capturing the scene without a word of protest from anyone. Karen stayed parked at the curb, watching through her window like a director monitoring a scene she'd written. When the officer asked for her statement directly, she suddenly claimed she'd misjudged the distance and hadn't realized it was actually my property. The officer apologized, clearly embarrassed, and left within minutes. But the damage was already done. Mia cried that night, asking if Daddy did something wrong. Renee held her, glaring at me over her shoulder, not with anger at me, but at everything happening. I called Tony that evening, my hands still shaking slightly. "She called the cops on me for standing on my own porch," I said. He went quiet for a moment, then said something I'd remember for the rest of this ordeal. "That woman sounds desperate, not powerful. Desperate people," Tony explained, escalate because they're protecting something bigger than a lawn violation. He asked casual questions. How long had Karen lived there? Where had she moved from? Did anyone actually know her before Willow Creek? I realized I had no answers. The next morning, Linda posted in the community chat that certain residents continue displaying concerning behavior toward longtime community leaders. No names. Again. But everyone knew. Comments piled up. Some supportive of Karen. A few quietly sympathetic toward us. Invisible allies too scared to speak up. Gary texted me privately that night. I saw everything. If he'd say that publicly. Silence followed for almost an hour before he replied. I have a family too. David. You understand. I did understand. And that scared me more than Karen ever had. Renee wanted to move. But something in me refused to let a woman with a clipboard and a superiority complex chase us out of a home we'd worked years to afford. Instead, I decided to actually learn who Karen Whitfield really was. I searched public records online that night. County property listings, old news archives, anything with her name attached. Most results were mundane. PDA newsletters, a garden club award from 2015. But one search result loaded strangely, then vanished entirely before I could click it. Curious, I mentioned the vanishing link to Tony. He went quiet again, then said, "Send me everything you've got. Names, dates, anything." I hesitated, unsure if hiring a PI over an HOA dispute was overkill. Tony's answer settled it. This isn't about the HOA anymore. Within days, Tony called back sounding oddly careful. Where did Karen Whitfield live before Willow Creek? I didn't know. Nobody seemed to know. And not one person could name where she'd come from before that. Not even Gary, who'd known her longest. That gap bothered me more than any fine ever had. People talk about their past, their hometowns, old jobs, exes, something. Karen talked only about Willow Creek, as if her entire existence began the day she moved in and never looked backward once. Meanwhile, the fines kept coming. A new notice cited our porch light bulb as insufficiently warm-toned, violating an aesthetic ordinance I'd never heard read aloud in any meeting. I paid it silently, letting Karen believe she'd worn me down completely. Renee noticed my sudden calm and asked what changed. I told her the truth. I wasn't giving up. I was gathering. She studied my face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Just don't lose yourself doing it," she said. I promised her I wouldn't. Mia, meanwhile, had started drawing pictures of our house surrounded by little clouds she called worry clouds. I taped one to my office wall as motivation. Every fine, every notice, every smug smile from Karen's SUV window became one more reason to keep digging quietly. 2 weeks later, Karen escalated again, filing a formal complaint accusing me of verbal intimidation toward a board member over the Porch incident, despite the police report clearly stating I'd said nothing threatening at all. The board scheduled a hearing to discuss corrective action. I walked into that hearing calm, folder in hand, unaware it was merely the opening move in something far larger than either of us understood yet. A slow unraveling. Karen herself had unknowingly started the day she dialed those officers over nothing. The hearing room smelled like stale coffee and printer toner. Karen sat at the head of the table, flanked by Linda and 2 board members I barely recognized. She opened with a prepared statement calling me a pattern of escalating hostility toward community leadership. I calmly presented the police report, which stated no threat had occurred and the officer had left without incident. Karen waved it aside. "Reports don't capture tone, David. I was there. Unsafe." Nobody asked why she'd stayed parked, watching, if she felt unsafe. Tom, the older board member, finally spoke up for the first time in months. "Karen, the report clearly says he did nothing wrong." Karen's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Tom, I'd expect more support from someone who understands what leadership sacrifices require." The threat in her voice was unmistakable, even wrapped in pleasant language. Tom sat back, quiet again. I watched the exchange and realized something important. Karen didn't need facts to win. She needed fear, and she'd cultivated it patiently for over a decade. The board ultimately issued me a formal warning. No fine, but a written mark on file. Whatever that meant. I accepted it without argument, smiling politely, because Tony had told me something the night before that changed my entire strategy. Patience wins against people who rely on panic. Outside the meeting, Gary caught up to me in the parking lot, glancing around nervously. "She's been HOA president since before I moved here. Nobody's ever run against her. People tried once, years back. It didn't end well for them," he said, then walked away quickly. "Didn't end well how?" I called after him, but he'd already reached his car. That phrase sat with me the entire drive home. Renee asked how the hearing went. I told her about the warning, then repeated Gary's words. She frowned. Then gossip. That night, Tony called with an update. Karen Whitfield, as far as public records showed, hadn't existed under that name before roughly 12 years ago. No birth record match, no prior address, no employment history predating her arrival in Willow Creek. It was as if she'd appeared from nowhere. "People don't just appear," Tony said. "Sometimes they disappear first." He explained gently that name changes happen legally for plenty of ordinary reasons. Marriage, personal preference, Nothing sinister necessarily. But paired with the vanishing search result from before, something didn't sit right with either of us. I asked Tony to dig carefully, quietly, nothing illegal, just public documents and patient research. He agreed but warned me it might take weeks. Meanwhile, life in Willow Creek continued its slow squeeze. Another fine here, another passive-aggressive chat message there. Small cuts accumulating steadily. Linda started walking her dog past our house 3 times daily instead of once, always slowing near our windows. Renee joked darkly that we should start selling tickets to the show. Mia, more perceptive than either of us gave her credit for, asked, "Why does she hate us?" I didn't have a real answer for my daughter. I told her some people need to feel important more than they need to be kind. Mia considered this seriously, then said, "That sounds lonely," and went back to drawing, leaving me strangely moved by her simple honesty. A month into Tony's search, he found something odd buried in an old county newspaper archive from a small town in Ohio, roughly matching Karen's estimated age and description, involving a woman named Diane Marsh and an HOA embezzlement scandal from 13 years earlier. The article was brief, poorly scanned, half the details illegible. Diane Marsh had served as treasurer for a homeowners association outside Columbus before disappearing amid allegations of misappropriated community funds, totaling nearly $40,000. No arrest photo existed in the archive. Tony cautioned me against jumping to conclusions. Names, ages, and vague descriptions weren't proof of anything. Still, the coincidence nagged at both of us. I asked him to pull whatever court records existed from that Ohio case, if any survived that far back digitally. Meanwhile, Karen filed another complaint, this time claiming our security camera, mounted years earlier facing our own driveway, violated resident privacy by potentially capturing footage of her vehicle passing by. The audacity almost made me laugh out loud during the board meeting. I calmly explained the camera pointed exclusively at my driveway, nothing more, and offered to show footage proving it. Karen refused to view it, insisting the mere possibility of exposure constituted a violation. The board, exhausted by her relentless persistence, quietly tabled the complaint indefinitely. That small, quiet win felt enormous after months of losses. Renee noticed the shift in me first. "You're not shrinking anymore," she said one evening, watching me calmly delete another baseless notice from our HOA portal instead of stressing over it for hours. Tony called again a week later, voice careful. The Ohio court records had partially survived a records migration. Diane Marsh had indeed been charged with embezzlement and fraud, but the case never reached trial. She'd skipped town before her scheduled court date, and a bench warrant followed. A bench warrant. During our call, Tony reminded me warrants like that, if never resolved, often remained active indefinitely across state lines, quietly waiting, forgotten by everyone except the system that issued them years earlier without closure. I asked the obvious question, was Diane Marsh actually Karen Whitfield? Tony admitted he couldn't confirm it yet, not without a proper facial comparison, fingerprints, or a definitive paper trail linking the two identities directly and legally beyond reasonable doubt. Still, the pattern was chilling. A woman vanishes from an HOA scandal in Ohio, reappears years later under a new name, and rises to obsessive, controlling power over another HOA states away. If true, it wasn't coincidence. It was a pattern she'd perfected. I didn't tell Renee everything yet, not wanting to build hope on speculation. But I did start smiling more during board meetings, calm in a way that visibly unsettled Karen, who seemed to sense something shifting even without knowing exactly what it was. She escalated in response, perhaps sensing the ground shifting beneath her. A new rule appeared in the HOA newsletter. All unregistered vehicles, including guest cars, would now require pre-approval 48 hours in advance. A rule that conveniently excluded her own frequent guests entirely. Renee's mother visited that weekend, unaware of the new rule, and found a violation notice on her rental car by morning. Renee finally lost her composure, storming to Karen's door directly, something I'd never seen her do before in 18 months of harassment. Karen answered calmly, almost pleased by the confrontation. Rules exist for consistency, Renee. I don't make exceptions, even for family. Renee pointed out Karen's own sister had parked unregistered for 3 days the previous month without any notice appearing anywhere. Karen's expression flickered, just slightly, before recovering into practiced composure. That's simply not accurate, she said smoothly. Though Renee had photos, timestamps included, from our own driveway camera footage capturing the sister's car parked exactly where she claimed. That night, Renee finally asked me directly what Tony had found. I told her everything: the Ohio case, the vanished identity, the bench warrant, the missing years. Renee sat quietly for a long moment, then said, "We need to be very, very careful now." She was right. It's something significant to hide. Cornering her carelessly could trigger unpredictable, even dangerous, reactions. We agreed to keep gathering evidence patiently, letting Tony work methodically, while outwardly appearing exactly as unbothered and compliant as possible. Tom, the quiet board member, approached me privately the following week, oddly nervous. "I don't know what you're doing," he said, "but whatever it is, keep going. Some of us have wanted her gone for years. We just never had the courage." I asked why nobody had challenged her leadership directly in 11 years. Tom sighed heavily. "Small things, embarrassing things. She collects them like ammunition, quietly, then uses them exactly when she needs leverage most." That explained everything. For a brief stretch, things went strangely quiet. No new notices, no surprise fines, no slow-rolling SUV past our porch. Renee called it suspicious. I called it strategic. Both of us sensing Karen was recalibrating rather than retreating, watching us as closely as ever. Mia's school held a family day, and for the first time in months, we simply enjoyed an ordinary Saturday without glancing nervously toward Karen's house. It felt almost foreign, this quiet, like holding your breath so long you forget what normal breathing feels like. Tony used the lull to dig deeper, requesting archived fingerprint records from the original Ohio embezzlement case, hoping something official still existed in storage decades after digital filing became standard practice for most county systems nationwide. Meanwhile, Gary quietly slipped me copies of HOA financial statements from the past 3 years, something technically against policy for him to share, but he said his conscience finally outweighed his fear. "Look at the landscaping budget line," he whispered before leaving. The landscaping budget showed unusually high annual expenses, nearly double neighboring HOAs of similar size. According to public comparison data Tony pulled separately. Yet our actual shared landscaping looked barely maintained beyond the entrance sign and Karen's personal cul-de-sac section. I asked Gary directly where the extra money went. He shrugged uncomfortably. Karen handles vendor contracts personally. Nobody else reviews invoices. She said it streamlines efficiency. Streamlines efficiency. I repeated silently, recognizing the exact phrase Diane Marsh once used in that old Ohio article. That detail hit differently than anything before it. The same manufactured corporate language. The same total control over money nobody else could verify. The same isolated position of unchecked authority. History wasn't just rhyming anymore. Felt like it was repeating word for word. Renee suggested quietly reporting suspicions to the county HOA oversight board. But Tony cautioned patience. If she's who we think she is, she's evaded consequences before. We need something undeniable, not just suspicious patterns that a good lawyer could explain away easily. So we waited, gathering quietly, letting the lull stretch on. Karen resumed her rounds eventually, slower now, more measured, as though testing the temperature of the neighborhood before committing fully to her next move. I recognized the caution of someone sensing danger she couldn't name yet. One evening, Linda approached me alone at the mailbox, unusually quiet, without her usual clipboard energy. "You should be careful," she said softly. "Karen doesn't lose." Meant exactly. Linda just shook her head and walked away without elaborating further. That warning stuck with me longer than any fine ever had. Linda, Karen's most loyal enforcer for years, sounded almost afraid herself, as if she too understood something dangerous simmering beneath Karen's polished exterior that the rest of the neighborhood hadn't fully grasped yet. Tony called again days later, voice tight with cautious excitement. An old county clerk in Ohio, now retired, remembered the Diane Marsh case personally and agreed to a phone interview, describing a woman matching Karen's exact height, build, and mannerisms in vivid, specific detail. The clerk recalled Diane Marsh vanishing the night before her court date, taking nearly $40,000 in community reserve funds with her, leaving behind a devastated HOA board and a warrant that, as far as anyone in Ohio knew, remained active and unresolved to this day. Armed with that interview, Tony pushed further, requesting Karen Whitfield's official name change filing from county records, hoping it might reveal her previous legal identity directly, closing the final gap between suspicion and undeniable, court-admissible proof of who she truly was. While we waited on those records, Karen escalated dramatically. She proposed a new HOA amendment at the next meeting granting the board authority to place liens on homes for unpaid fines exceeding $300, a threshold our accumulated fines were rapidly approaching. The proposal shocked even longtime residents. Several homeowners who'd previously stayed silent finally spoke up during public comment, worried about losing equity over trivial infractions like mailbox paint or slightly overgrown hedges. Karen defended it as protecting community investment values. I stood up calmly during comment period, presenting documented evidence of selective enforcement. Our family's fines compared against identical violations on other properties left completely unaddressed for months or years. The room grew noticeably tense, murmurs spreading through rows of folding chairs. Karen's composure cracked slightly for the first time in public. "You're twisting isolated incidents into some conspiracy, David." I've dedicated 11 years to this community's well-being. I simply replied, then you won't mind an independent audit of enforcement records and finances. The room went dead silent. Tom, sitting near the back, allowed himself a small, satisfied smile he quickly hid behind his hand. Karen's eyes locked onto mine with something colder than annoyance now, something closer to genuine, calculated alarm beneath the surface composure. She tabled the lien amendment for further review, an unusual retreat for someone who never backed down publicly. Renee squeezed my hand under the table. We both understood. Cracks were finally forming in 11 years of untouchable control. However small they still seemed. Driving home, Renee asked if I thought Karen suspected we were investigating her. I honestly didn't know. Proposal suggested she felt cornered by something bigger than one homeowner's complaints about mailbox paint and porch furniture. That night, Tony called with the name change filing details finally located. Karen Whitfield had legally changed her name from Diane Marsh exactly 12 years earlier, filed quietly in a different county from where the original embezzlement case had occurred, likely intentionally. The filing listed no explanation beyond personal reasons, standard legal boilerplate. But paired with the interview, the financial patterns, and the mannerisms the retired clerk described, we finally had something concrete connecting Karen Whitfield directly to Diane Marsh's unresolved criminal past. Tony explained our next step carefully. Verify the active warrant still existed in the system. Since some warrants quietly expire or get administratively closed after enough years pass without action from either party involved in the original case. A contact of Tony's within Ohio law enforcement confirmed, off the record, that the warrant for Diane Marsh remained active, never resolved, never dismissed, simply sitting dormant in the system for over a decade, waiting for the day someone finally connected the dots. That night, I barely slept. Renee found me at the kitchen table at 2 a.m, staring at the folder Tony had compiled. We have to be smart about this, she whispered. Karen's dangerous precisely because she's desperate to protect her new life. We agreed the evidence needed proper legal channels, not vigilante confrontation. Reporting anonymously risked her destroying evidence or fleeing entirely before authorities acted. We needed something airtight, timed correctly, delivered to people who couldn't be intimidated by Karen's usual tactics. Meanwhile, Karen seemed to sense the shifting tide without knowing its exact source. She began appearing less frequently on her rounds, delegating enforcement duties increasingly to Linda, who now patrolled the street with visible reluctance rather than her usual eager energy. Gary confided that Karen had grown noticeably paranoid at recent board meetings, questioning who'd accessed certain financial documents and demanding to know why several homeowners suddenly seemed less compliant, less afraid, than they had just months earlier during her reign. I continued documenting everything meticulously while Tony coordinated quietly with a contact at the county sheriff's office, someone experienced in handling sensitive extradition matters involving decade-old warrants crossing state lines, ensuring nothing would be mishandled or dismissed on a technicality. The plan formed slowly: gather undeniable identity confirmation, present findings through proper legal channels, and let law enforcement handle the arrest itself, rather than risking a confrontation that could allow Karen to disappear again as she had done once before. Years ago, Renee worried aloud about safety, given how unpredictable cornered people could become. I reassured her, though privately I shared the same concern, remembering Linda's warning at the mailbox. Karen doesn't lose, ever. We intended to prove that warning finally. Completely wrong. At the next HOA meeting, Karen arrived visibly different. Tighter smile, sharper tone. Eyes scanning the room like she was searching for enemies among neighbors she'd controlled effortlessly for over a decade without a single serious challenge to her authority. She announced surprise inspections would begin immediately, citing recent concerning behavior patterns among certain residents, without naming anyone directly. Everyone understood exactly who she meant. I simply nodded politely, betraying nothing, letting her escalate exactly as Tony had predicted she would. That week, Linda showed up at our door directly, camera in hand, demanding entry to inspect our garage for unauthorized storage violations. Renee calmly informed her that entering without prior written notice, per the HOA's own bylaws, constituted trespassing on private property. Linda hesitated, clearly uncomfortable, then retreated without argument for the first time since we'd moved in. Later that evening, she texted Renee privately, apologizing quietly, admitting Karen had pressured her aggressively to escalate tactics against our family specifically, above all others. Renee shared the message with me immediately. It was the first crack in Karen's inner circle. Someone finally documenting, in writing, targeted harassment directed specifically at our family rather than uniform community enforcement Karen always claimed publicly to practice fairly. I forwarded Linda's message to Tony, who added it carefully to our growing file. "This helps," he said. Alongside a hidden criminal identity paints a much clearer picture for both civil complaints and criminal referral purposes. Karen, sensing Linda's hesitation, began isolating her too, excluding her from certain board conversations, treating her coldly at the following meeting. Linda, once Karen's most loyal enforcer, now sat quietly in the back, visibly uncertain about her place in Karen's shrinking inner circle. Watching Karen isolate even her closest ally revealed something important. Her control had always depended entirely on fear and loyalty, never genuine relationships. The moment either faltered even slightly, her carefully constructed authority began showing real, visible cracks to anyone paying attention. Tom approached me quietly after that meeting. "She's slipping," he said. "I've watched her operate for years. She only gets this controlling when she's genuinely scared of losing something important." I nodded, knowing exactly what, or rather who, she was truly afraid of losing. Renee's mother, still frustrated over her rental car violation, offered to write a formal statement about the incident for whatever legal purpose it might eventually serve. Every small piece mattered now, building toward something far larger than one family's suburban housing dispute. Tony finalized his report that week, cross-referencing fingerprints from an old Ohio employment application against a recent, legally obtained sample from Karen's gym membership renewal form, a long shot that miraculously matched perfectly, confirming her identity beyond any reasonable doubt. I stared at the report for a long time before showing Renee. Diane Marsh and Karen Whitfield were undeniably the same person, confirmed through fingerprints, matching physical descriptions, financial patterns, and now, an active bench warrant waiting patiently for over a decade. Renee cried, not from sadness, but overwhelming relief after 18 months of quiet suffering under Karen's relentless control. "We actually have her," she whispered. I held her tightly, aware that the hardest, most careful part still remained fully ahead of us. Tony advised submitting everything directly to local law enforcement first, allowing them to verify independently and coordinate properly with Ohio authorities regarding extradition procedures, rather than risking public exposure that might allow Karen time to flee before any arrest occurred. We scheduled a private meeting with a detective Tony trusted personally, someone experienced with cold cases and interstate warrants, understanding the sensitivity required when someone had successfully evaded justice for over a decade under an entirely fabricated new identity. The detective reviewed everything carefully, impressed by the thoroughness of Tony's documentation. "This is solid work," he said. "Give us 2 weeks to verify through proper channels before anyone approaches her directly. We don't want to risk her disappearing again." 2 weeks felt impossibly long. Knowing Karen still controlled our neighborhood daily, still issued fines, still drove slowly past our house like she owned every square inch of it. But we understood patience now mattered more than ever, after coming this far. Meanwhile, Karen escalated dramatically at the next board meeting, proposing to remove Tom entirely from the board for repeated insubordination, despite his relatively mild pushback over recent months. The motion passed narrowly, 3 votes to 2, Linda notably abstaining silently. Tom took the removal gracefully, though privately told me afterward it confirmed everything he'd suspected. Karen eliminated anyone showing even slight independence the moment she sensed genuine threat gathering somewhere beyond her immediate control or awareness. Gary, increasingly uncomfortable with Karen's mounting paranoia, quietly resigned from the treasurer position the following week, citing personal reasons publicly, though he confided privately that he simply couldn't stomach continuing to manage books he suspected were being manipulated. With Gary gone, Karen appointed a new treasurer entirely loyal to her, someone who'd moved in only months earlier and owed her considerable favors already regarding expedited HOA approval on a home renovation project she desperately wanted completed quickly. The board now consisted almost entirely of Karen loyalists, save for one remaining skeptical voice too quiet to matter much practically. Watching her consolidate power so aggressively, right as the walls quietly closed in around her, felt darkly, almost tragically ironic. Renee pointed out the irony herself one evening. "She's tightening her grip precisely because she can feel it slipping," she said. I agreed completely, recognizing the same desperate pattern in every fine, every accusation, every sudden new rule targeting specifically our family. The detective called exactly 12 days later, confirming the warrant remained fully active and enforceable across state lines, and that Ohio authorities had been formally notified, requesting extradition cooperation once local law enforcement made contact and confirmed Karen's current identity officially. "We'll need you available for a brief statement," the detective explained, "but otherwise, let us handle everything moving forward. Please continue behaving completely normally around her until we contact you again." I promised I would, though normal now felt nearly impossible. That week, Karen filed yet another complaint against us, claiming our holiday decorations, simple string lights along the porch railing, violated seasonal display ordinances requiring pre-approval 3 weeks in advance, a rule apparently invented specifically the previous afternoon. I accepted the notice calmly, even thanked her politely at the mailbox, watching genuine confusion flicker briefly across her face at my unexpected composure. She'd grown accustomed to visible frustration from her targets. Not calm, knowing patience from someone holding real power over her future. Renee noticed the shift too. "You almost feel sorry for her," she said that night. I admitted I did, Slightly, imagining the exhausting effort required maintaining such an elaborate false identity for over a decade. Always watching, always controlling, never truly safe or at rest. But sympathy faded quickly whenever I remembered Mia crying that night after the police incident. Or Renee's mother receiving an unfair violation. Or 18 months of manufactured fear designed purely to maintain Karen's fragile, desperate illusion of untouchable suburban authority. Karen's behavior grew increasingly erratic that final week before the planned arrest. She confronted a random contractor working on a neighbor's roof, accusing him of unauthorized equipment storage, screaming loudly enough that 3 separate households called the actual police themselves. The responding officer, different from before, calmly de-escalated the situation, later noting in his report that the complainant appeared visibly agitated beyond the circumstances warranted. That report, too, would eventually become part of the growing documentation against her. Linda finally distanced herself completely, moving her dog-walking route away from our street entirely, avoiding Karen's calls and texts for days at a time. Karen, sensing abandonment from even her most loyal supporter, grew visibly more desperate and unpredictable by the day. She began following our family's daily schedule almost obsessively, appearing at the grocery store, the gas station, even lingering near Mia's school pickup line, always claiming coincidence, though the frequency stretched believability well beyond any reasonable, innocent explanation. Renee grew genuinely frightened for the first time, worried Karen's escalating desperation might turn dangerous rather than simply irritating. We contacted the detective early, explaining the sudden stalking-like behavior. He assured us the timeline would accelerate given this new information. That same afternoon, Karen appeared at our door directly, something she'd never done before in 18 months of indirect harassment through notices and phone calls. Her composure had visibly cracked, eyes wide, voice trembling slightly beneath forced, brittle politeness. "I know you've been asking questions," she said quietly, glancing nervously toward the street. "I don't know what you think you've found, David, but I'd strongly advise you drop it. For your family's sake." The threat, thinly veiled, chilled me completely. I remained calm, giving nothing away. "I don't know what you mean, Karen." She studied my face for a long, uncomfortable moment, clearly searching for confirmation she never found, before turning abruptly and walking briskly back toward her own house. I immediately called the detective, relaying the direct threat. He confirmed the timeline needed to move faster now, worried Karen might attempt to flee entirely if she genuinely suspected exposure was imminent, exactly as she'd apparently done once before in Ohio. That night, Renee suggested temporarily staying at her mother's house until the situation resolved safely. I agreed reluctantly, hating the idea of Karen chasing us from our own home again, even briefly, but prioritizing Mia's safety above any personal pride involved. We packed quietly, telling neighbors we were simply visiting family for a few days. Nothing unusual. Karen's SUV sat parked conspicuously across the street as we loaded the car, watching silently, making no move to approach or speak to either of us. Tony called that evening with troubling news. Karen had apparently begun researching flight information online. According to a source monitoring public records, requests connected loosely to her recent activity, suggesting she genuinely feared exposure and possible imminent arrest. The detective moved quickly, coordinating an expedited warrant verification with Ohio authorities directly, hoping to arrest Karen before she attempted fleeing entirely, potentially disappearing again for another decade under yet another fabricated identity somewhere else across the country. 2 days later, while we stayed quietly at Renee's mother's house, the detective called with updates. Local police had been dispatched to conduct a welfare check. Officially, though really intended to confirm Karen remained at her residence and hadn't fled yet. Karen answered the door calmly, according to the officer's report, claiming everything was fine, dismissing concerns quickly and firmly. But neighbors later mentioned noticing suitcases loaded into her SUV that same afternoon, packed and ready for a sudden, unexplained departure. The detective grew increasingly concerned about the timeline slipping. Extradition paperwork from Ohio, while progressing, still required several more days of proper legal processing before local authorities could execute an actual arrest warrant against Karen directly and lawfully. Meanwhile, Karen returned to her HOA duties briefly, perhaps trying to maintain appearances, issuing one final absurd notice regarding a neighbor's flagpole height violating community skyline aesthetics, an ordinance so ridiculous it briefly became the subject of neighborhood jokes. I couldn't help noticing the strange normalcy of it all. A woman facing imminent arrest for decade-old embezzlement still finding time to find someone over flagpole height, as though maintaining the illusion of control mattered more than her own impending downfall. Renee pointed out something important during those tense waiting days. Karen's obsessive need for control likely stemmed directly from her fear of losing everything again, exactly as she'd lost her old life suddenly and completely years earlier back in Ohio. That understanding didn't excuse her behavior, but it explained the underlying desperation driving 18 months of relentless harassment against our family, specifically someone she likely recognized, consciously or not, as uniquely capable of eventually exposing everything she'd worked hard to hide. Tom reached out privately, having heard rumors circulating about Karen's strange behavior recently. "Something's happening, isn't it?" he asked directly. I couldn't confirm details yet, but told him simply to stay patient and watch closely over the coming days ahead. Gary, too, sensed the shifting atmosphere within the neighborhood, texting me cryptically that Karen had canceled the upcoming board meeting entirely, citing a vague personal emergency, something completely unprecedented in her 11 years of relentless, unwavering HOA leadership commitment. The detective called again, finally with definitive news. Ohio authorities had approved expedited extradition processing, and local police would execute the arrest warrant the following morning, coordinating carefully to avoid giving Karen any additional warning or opportunity to flee beforehand. That night felt endless. Renee and I barely slept, Mia sensing our tension despite our best efforts hiding it from her completely. She asked quietly if the lady with the clipboard was finally going away. I told her, honestly, that she probably was. Morning arrived cold and quiet. The detective asked us to remain away from the neighborhood entirely during the arrest itself, promising a call the moment everything concluded safely, and according to proper legal procedure protecting everyone involved throughout the process. We waited anxiously at Renee's mother's kitchen table, coffee going cold, both of us checking our phones every few minutes, replaying 18 months of fines, threats, and quiet suffering, hoping this morning would finally, completely close that painful chapter. At exactly 9:17, the detective called. "It's done," he said simply. "She's in custody." Renee exhaled a breath she'd apparently been holding for what felt like 18 months straight, tears streaming freely down her face at those simple, Powerful words. The detective explained officers had arrived early, catching Karen mid-preparation for what appeared to be an imminent departure. Suitcases already loaded, cash withdrawn recently from multiple accounts. All consistent with someone planning to flee before authorities finally caught up completely. She reportedly denied everything initially, insisting the officers had the wrong person entirely, until confronted directly with matching fingerprint evidence and photographs from the original Ohio case, at which point her composure finally completely collapsed under the accumulated weight of years. Neighbors watched from windows and porches as Karen Whitfield, HOA president of 11 years, was led calmly but firmly to a patrol car, her carefully maintained authority crumbling publicly for the first time in front of the very community she'd controlled so completely. Linda later told Renee she'd watched the entire arrest from her front window, feeling genuinely conflicted, part relief, part guilt for having enforced Karen's cruelty for years without ever questioning where her authority truly came from or what she'd been hiding. Tom called me directly that afternoon, voice thick with emotion. 11 years, he said simply, unable to finish the sentence completely. I understood exactly what he meant. 11 years of unchecked, unquestioned power finally, completely ending in a single quiet morning. Gary texted simply, "Thank you. Nothing more needed between us after everything." He'd quietly risked sharing financial records that ultimately helped build the case against a woman he trusted. Mistakenly. 4 years within their shared HOA leadership responsibilities together. We returned home that evening, driving slowly past Karen's now empty house. Still and quiet. No SUV parked menacingly in the driveway. No clipboard-wielding figure watching from behind curtains. Just an ordinary house finally stripped completely of its false authority. Mia asked if the lady was really gone for good this time. I told her yes. Honestly, completely, watching relief and confusion mixed together on her young face. Too complicated an ending for a 7-year-old to fully process immediately that evening. The following days brought a strange, unfamiliar quiet to Willow Creek. No violation notices appeared anywhere. No slow-rolling SUV monitored driveways suspiciously. Neighbors who'd stayed silent for years suddenly found themselves talking openly, comparing stories, realizing collectively how widespread the harassment truly was. Renee's mother learned her rental car violation, along with dozens of similarly unfair fines issued over recent years, would likely be reviewed and refunded once the county completed a full financial audit of HOA records under Karen's extended leadership tenure. The new interim HOA president, Tom, finally restored to the board immediately following Karen's arrest, called an emergency meeting to address the situation transparently, promising complete financial review and a genuine reset of enforcement policies moving forward, fairly and equally. Attendance at that meeting exceeded anything Willow Creek had seen in years. Homeowners finally comfortable speaking honestly about experiences they'd suppressed for over a decade, sharing stories eerily similar to our own family's prolonged, exhausting ordeal under Karen's obsessive control. Linda attended too, sitting quietly near the back, eventually standing to offer a genuine, tearful apology for years spent enforcing rules she now recognized as selectively, cruelly applied against specific families rather than uniformly across the entire neighborhood community. I accepted her apology, understanding fear and manipulation had driven much of her behavior alongside genuine loyalty misplaced entirely in someone undeserving of it. Holding on to anger toward everyone involved felt exhausting, unnecessary, now that the actual source had finally been removed completely. News of Karen's arrest eventually reached local media. A brief segment on the evening news detailing her decade-long evasion of an active warrant, her fabricated identity, and the surprising role a private investigator hired by an ordinary homeowner played in her downfall. Reporters called our house repeatedly, requesting interviews. Renee and I agreed to one brief statement, choosing to protect Mia's privacy above satisfying public curiosity about the strange, dramatic saga that had consumed our neighborhood for the better part of 2 years. Tony called, genuinely proud of how everything concluded. "You did the hard part," he told me. "Staying patient, documenting everything properly. I just connected some dots you'd already started drawing yourself." I thanked him repeatedly, knowing we owed him everything. The county audit, completed weeks later, revealed Karen had indeed diverted nearly $60,000 from HOA reserves over her 11-year tenure, funneled through inflated landscaping contracts with a company later discovered to be owned by a relative under a different name. That discovery explained the mysteriously high landscaping budget Gary had flagged months earlier, connecting perfectly to the same manipulative financial patterns established originally back in Ohio under her previous identity as Diane Marsh, treasurer turned embezzler turned fugitive. Karen's extradition to Ohio proceeded smoothly following local charges related to Willow Creek's embezzled funds, meaning she'd eventually face consequences in 2 separate states for remarkably similar crimes committed roughly 13 years apart, under 2 entirely different identities. Renee and I attended one court hearing before the case transferred fully to Ohio jurisdiction, watching Karen appear notably smaller somehow, stripped of her usual authority and confidence. Just another defendant now facing consequences she'd successfully avoided for over a decade. She glanced toward us briefly during that hearing, expression unreadable, somewhere between resentment and exhausted resignation. I felt no satisfaction in her suffering exactly, just quiet relief that 18 months of manufactured fear had finally, definitively reached its natural conclusion. Mia's teacher mentioned she'd been drawing happier pictures lately, houses without worry clouds, simple suns and gardens instead. Renee cried happy tears reading that note, both of us realizing how deeply Karen's harassment had affected even our young daughter's sense of safety. Life gradually returned to something resembling genuine normalcy. We repainted the mailbox purely for our own enjoyment this time, planted new flowers without fear of arbitrary violation notices, and finally hosted the backyard barbecue we'd postponed repeatedly throughout Karen's reign. Tom, now permanently elected HOA president in a landslide vote weeks later, implemented transparent enforcement policies, requiring documented evidence, and consistent application across every property equally, ending the selective, fear-based governance that had defined Willow Creek for over a decade. Gary rejoined the board as treasurer again, insisting on independent financial oversight this time. Multiple signatures required for any expense exceeding basic thresholds, ensuring no single person could ever again manipulate community funds so completely undetected for years at a time. Linda, surprisingly, became one of our closest neighborhood friends over the following months, her genuine remorse translating into real change, organizing a community welcome committee that actually welcomed people warmly instead of scrutinizing their mailboxes within their first week. Renee's mother received her refund eventually, along with a written apology from the newly reformed HOA board, closure she appreciated more for the acknowledgement itself than the modest $60 amount returned to her after the unfair violation years earlier. I kept Tony's business card framed in my home office, alongside Mia's worry cloud drawing. Reminders of exactly how close we'd come to losing our peace entirely, and how patient, careful documentation ultimately mattered more than anger or impulsive confrontation ever could. Occasionally, neighbors still ask how we first suspected something deeper existed beneath Karen's controlling behavior. I always tell them honestly, it started with a simple, absurd feeling that calling police over someone standing on their own porch made absolutely no sense at all. That single moment, Karen dialing police over nothing, became the loose thread that eventually unraveled her entire fabricated identity, proving sometimes the smallest, most ridiculous overreach reveals far more about a person than years of quieter, more calculated cruelty ever could. Renee often reminds me how close we came to simply giving up, moving away, letting Karen win completely rather than risking the exhausting effort required proving what we suspected. Patience mattered more than proof. Honestly, she says, proof just followed eventually. Mia, older now and understanding more of what happened, occasionally asks questions about the clipboard lady, processing the experience the way children eventually process confusing adult conflicts. Piece by piece, understanding growing slowly alongside her own maturity and confidence. I've thought often about Karen's original crime back in Ohio, wondering what desperation or greed first drove Diane Marsh toward embezzlement, and what deeper fear kept Karen Whitfield controlling an entire neighborhood so obsessively for over a decade afterward. Perhaps control became her substitute for genuine security, a fabricated authority replacing whatever stability she'd lost the night she fled Ohio, leaving behind everything familiar to construct an entirely new, meticulously controlled existence somewhere nobody would recognize her. That theory doesn't excuse anything she did to our family or countless others across 2 states and 13 years, but it does explain the relentless, almost desperate energy behind every absurd notice, every baseless fine, every slow, threatening drive past our porch. Understanding her motivations, even partially, helped me eventually release the anger I'd carried throughout those 18 difficult months, replacing it gradually with something closer to quiet, hard-earned peace within our own home and neighborhood community once again. 6 months after her arrest, Karen's Ohio case finally reached formal sentencing. Renee and I received notice as affected parties, given our role in her eventual identification, and decided together to attend, seeking whatever closure the proceeding might genuinely offer us. The Columbus courtroom felt worlds away from our quiet suburban HOA meetings, formal and somber, filled with faces from her original victims, people who'd lost retirement savings and community trust 13 years earlier when Diane Marsh vanished overnight. Karen sat quietly at the defense table, dressed plainly, none of her usual blazers or authoritative posture remaining. She looked smaller somehow, stripped completely of the manufactured confidence that had once controlled an entire neighborhood without meaningful challenge for over a decade. The prosecutor detailed both crimes methodically, connecting Diane Marsh's original embezzlement directly to Karen Whitfield's identical pattern in Willow Creek, painting a clear picture of someone who'd never actually reformed, simply relocated and rebranded her manipulation under a fresh, unsuspecting identity. One of her original Ohio victims, an elderly man who'd lost nearly his entire retirement contribution to her original scheme, spoke during victim impact statements, voice trembling with 13 years of accumulated frustration finally finding proper legal acknowledgement and closure. I spoke too, briefly, describing 18 months of harassment, fear, and manufactured control our family endured under her second identity, emphasizing how her pattern of behavior clearly predated Willow Creek entirely. Proving this wasn't isolated misconduct but calculated, repeated exploitation. Karen's attorney argued for leniency, citing her age and the years passed since the original offense. The judge, unmoved, noted the deliberate, sustained deception across multiple identities and states as an aggravating factor deserving serious, appropriately proportional consequences. She received 7 years combined across both jurisdictions, accounting for embezzlement in Ohio, fraud charges from Willow Creek's HOA funds, and additional charges related to her fabricated identity documents used to establish an entirely fictional legal existence for over a decade. Watching the sentence delivered, I felt something unexpected. Not triumph exactly, but a quiet, exhausted sense that justice, delayed 13 years, had finally, fully arrived for everyone she'd harmed across 2 states, 2 identities, and countless quiet, unsuspecting victims. Renee squeezed my hand as the judge finished speaking, both of us thinking simultaneously of Mia's worry cloud drawings, Renee's mother's unfair violation, Gary's manipulated financial records, and Tom's years of quiet, powerless frustration under Karen's relentless, unchecked authority. Outside the courthouse, several original Ohio victims approached us, thanking us genuinely for pursuing the investigation that finally connected Diane Marsh to her new identity. Closure they'd stopped believing possible after 13 years of silence and unresolved frustration. One woman, tears in her eyes, mentioned she'd spent years wondering if Diane Marsh had simply gotten away with everything completely, disappearing forever unpunished. Learning she'd finally faced consequences, even over a decade later, meant more than she could properly express. Driving home from Columbus, Renee and I talked quietly about everything that had happened, from that first absurd mailbox violation to watching Karen sentenced formally in a courtroom hundreds of miles from the porch where this entire ordeal truly began. It's strange, Renee said, how something that started over grass length and mailbox paint ended up uncovering a 13-year fugitive. I agreed completely, marveling at how patient documentation and genuine curiosity had unraveled something far larger than either of us initially imagined. We picked Mia up from her grandmother's house that evening, and she immediately asked if the clipboard lady would ever come back to bother us again. I told her honestly, completely, that she wouldn't. Not this time. Not ever again. Mia considered this seriously, then simply said, "Good," before returning to her drawing. A colorful picture of our house, surrounded by sunshine instead of worry clouds, finally reflecting the genuine peace our family had worked so hard, so patiently, to reclaim. Back in Willow Creek, life continued settling into its new, healthier rhythm. Tom's transparent leadership style earned genuine community trust, something Karen had never actually possessed despite 11 years of enforced, fear-based compliance from nearly every household on the street. Gary's financial oversight reforms prevented any single person from ever again controlling HOA funds unchecked. Multiple signatures required for meaningful expenses. Quarterly public reports replacing Karen's previously opaque, unquestioned management of community resources for over a decade. Linda's Welcome Committee genuinely welcomed new families now, offering casseroles and honest advice instead of clipboards and veiled threats. A small but meaningful transformation reflecting the broader healing occurring gradually throughout the entire neighborhood community together. Renee's mother, fully refunded and formally apologized to, joked that she'd never park an unregistered vehicle in Willow Creek again, though everyone laughed knowing the joke itself represented how far the neighborhood had traveled from its previous fear-driven atmosphere entirely. I still keep Tony's original case file folder, digital and physical copies both, somewhere safe, a permanent record of exactly how patient, careful documentation eventually exposed a decade-long deception that countless people across 2 states had unknowingly, quietly enabled. Occasionally, new neighbors ask about the strange, dramatic history behind Willow Creek's current transparent, community-focused leadership. I tell the story honestly now, without exaggeration, letting the simple, absurd truth speak clearly for itself. It started with police called over nothing. That absurdity, standing calmly on my own porch while officers arrived expecting something dangerous, became the accidental catalyst exposing 13 years of hidden fraud, manipulation, and fear across 2 states, 2 identities, and countless unsuspecting, quietly suffering victims. Mia, now understanding more of the story as she's grown older, occasionally tells classmates proudly that her dad solved a mystery in their neighborhood. A simplified but honestly accurate summary of everything our family patiently endured and eventually completely overcame together. Renee sometimes wonders aloud what might have happened had we simply moved away early on, avoiding confrontation entirely rather than documenting patiently and pursuing genuine answers. We both agree it likely would have simply delayed Karen's eventual, inevitable exposure elsewhere. Someone, eventually, somewhere, would have noticed the same patterns we did. The mysterious lack of history, the obsessive control, the manipulated finances. We simply happened to be the family patient and stubborn enough to actually follow those suspicions through completely. Tom mentioned recently that several other HOAs in neighboring counties reached out following news coverage of Karen's case, requesting guidance on implementing similar transparent, accountable leadership structures, hoping to prevent their own communities from experiencing anything remotely similar. That ripple effect felt strangely meaningful, knowing our prolonged, exhausting ordeal ultimately contributed toward broader positive change extending well beyond our own quiet neighborhood street, protecting other unsuspecting families from experiencing similar manufactured fear and unchecked authority. Gary eventually left his position voluntarily after successfully implementing lasting financial reforms, confident the new oversight structure would prevent future manipulation regardless of who specifically served in leadership roles moving forward within Willow Creek's HOA governance. Linda remained active in community leadership, genuinely reformed, occasionally speaking publicly about recognizing manipulation and fear-based control within community organizations, using her own uncomfortable experience enforcing Karen's cruelty as a cautionary lesson for others facing similar situations. As for Karen, currently serving her combined sentence across both jurisdictions, I occasionally wonder if she'll attempt yet another fabricated identity, once eventually released, or whether 13 years of consequences finally completely broke whatever pattern originally drove her relentless deception. Tony believes people like Karen rarely fully change, simply adapt their methods slightly following consequences. I hope, genuinely, he's wrong this time, though I understand why experience taught him such carefully guarded, professional skepticism throughout his investigative career. Renee and I eventually decided sharing our story publicly, beyond the brief local news segment, might genuinely help other families recognizing similar patterns of obsessive HOA control before it escalated as dramatically or lasted as long as ours unfortunately did. We spoke at a regional community organizing conference months later, describing patient documentation strategies, recognizing manipulation patterns, and knowing when situations genuinely warrant professional investigation rather than simply enduring harassment silently out of fear or exhaustion. Several attendees approached afterward, sharing eerily similar experiences with their own HOA leadership, some considering hiring investigators themselves. After hearing exactly how effectively patient, methodical research eventually exposed Karen's decade-long fabricated identity and hidden criminal history, that conference, strangely, became one of the most meaningful outcomes of our entire ordeal, transforming 18 months of personal suffering into genuinely useful guidance, helping other families recognize warning signs before their own situations escalated dangerously out of control. Mia's school later invited me to speak briefly during a career day event, describing construction work primarily, though several curious kids asked eagerly about the HOA lady who went to jail, clearly having heard simplified versions from their own parents. I kept my answer simple and age-appropriate. Sometimes people pretend to be someone they're not, and sometimes patient, careful people eventually discover the truth. Mia beamed proudly from her classroom seat, clearly enjoying her father's unexpected neighborhood notoriety among classmates. Renee jokes occasionally that we should write an actual book about everything that happened, though we both agree reliving certain details, particularly that terrifying afternoon police arrived over nothing, remains difficult even now, years removed from the actual events themselves. Tony still calls occasionally, checking in, joking that our case remains one of his most satisfying professional experiences, connecting seemingly unrelated details across 13 years and 2 states into one clear, undeniable, legally actionable picture of sustained deception. I thanked him again recently, genuinely, acknowledging that without his patient, methodical investigative work, Karen might still be controlling Willow Creek today, still issuing absurd violations, still calling police over nothing, still hiding successfully behind a decade-old fabricated identity. Willow Creek today looks remarkably ordinary, indistinguishable from countless other suburban neighborhoods across the country. Exactly what we originally wanted when we first moved in, chasing simple, quiet family life away from unnecessary drama or manufactured neighborhood conflict entirely. The maple tree Mia and I planted together years earlier has grown considerably taller now, its shade stretching gently across our actual property line, never once actually reaching Karen's old house despite her original, absurd violation claim regarding its supposed excessive growth. Sometimes, standing on our porch with coffee in hand, exactly as I was that afternoon police first arrived unexpectedly, I think about how close 18 months of quiet, patient documentation came to simply feeling like paranoid overreaction rather than genuine, justified investigation. But patience, ultimately, proved entirely justified, transforming an absurd, frightening police encounter into the accidental catalyst exposing 13 years of hidden fraud, manipulation, and quietly accumulated suffering across 2 states and countless unsuspecting victims throughout Karen's extended deception. Renee often says the entire ordeal taught our family something valuable about trusting quiet instincts, documenting patiently rather than reacting impulsively, and recognizing that genuine truth, however deeply buried or carefully constructed, eventually surfaces given enough patient, careful attention. Mia, now understanding considerably more of the full story, occasionally reminds us both that the clipboard lady lost because daddy stayed calm. A simplified but genuinely accurate summary of exactly how patient documentation ultimately overcame 11 years of manufactured fear. I think often about Linda's warning that afternoon at the mailbox. Karen doesn't lose. Ever. Understanding now it reflected genuine belief built from years witnessing Karen's relentless, unchecked authority rather than any actual, inherent truth about outcomes eventually possible. Everyone loses eventually, I've learned, when their entire foundation rests upon fabricated identity, manufactured fear, and unchecked authority rather than genuine community trust or authentic personal history built honestly over time rather than constructed carefully to deceive. Tom, still serving as HOA president through consecutive, genuinely earned re-elections, occasionally mentions how differently Willow Creek feels now. Neighbors actually speaking honestly with each other. Disagreements resolved transparently rather than through manufactured fines or veiled institutional threats. Gary's financial reforms remain firmly in place years later. Quarterly reports genuinely public. Multiple signatures required for meaningful expenses, ensuring no future leader could ever again manipulate community funds as completely undetected as Karen managed for over a decade. Linda still occasionally apologizes, unprompted, for her role in forcing Karen's cruelty, though we've genuinely moved past it together as neighbors. Understanding fear and manipulation drove much of her original behavior rather than any inherent unkindness within her own character. Karen remains incarcerated currently, her combined sentence continuing steadily, while Willow Creek thrives genuinely under transparent, accountable leadership finally free from 11 years of fear-based, unchecked authority that once controlled nearly every household along our quiet suburban street. Our family, meanwhile, finally enjoys the simple, quiet suburban life we originally sought moving here years earlier, hosting regular barbecues, decorating freely for holidays without fear of arbitrary violation notices, and watching Mia grow up genuinely happy and secure. Renee occasionally reminds me how close we came to simply giving up entirely, moving away rather than patiently pursuing answers. Grateful now we chose persistence over convenient avoidance. However exhausting that patient persistence genuinely felt throughout those difficult 18 months. I keep Mia's original worry cloud drawing framed permanently in my home office, alongside her much happier, sunnier picture drawn months after Karen's arrest. A visual reminder of exactly how far our family traveled together throughout this entire ordeal. Sometimes genuine justice takes 13 years. 2 states. 1 absurd police call over nothing, and 1 patient family's stubborn refusal to simply accept manufactured fear as an acceptable price for quiet, ordinary suburban life they'd honestly, fairly earned themselves. Standing on my porch today, coffee in hand exactly as I was that fateful afternoon, I finally feel completely, genuinely safe again. Watching Mia ride her bike freely down our quiet street without a single worry cloud drifting anywhere overhead. Karen Whitfield, once known as Diane Marsh, finally faced consequences 13 years delayed, proving that patient documentation, genuine community courage, and one determined family's refusal to simply disappear quietly can eventually expose even the most carefully constructed deception. The porch is quiet now. And for the first time in 18 long months, nobody is watching.